At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. During the Q&A session of today's call, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 on your phone, record your name, and your line will be open. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would like to now turn the meeting over to Ms. Earlene Dowell. You may begin when ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you to Gina Bunn-Hector from the Census Bureau for hosting our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. First, due to unforeseen circumstances, we apologize for having to reschedule this November LED webinar to today. We appreciate you making time in your busy schedule to be here. In light of the recent transition to 100% telework, we are utilizing technology off-site to continue operations. We aim to minimize interruptions as much as possible, but we appreciate your patience if we experience any technical delays. Please utilize the chat feature to notify us of issues should any arise, and we will do our best to address them. All webinars and Q&A sessions are recorded and will be accessible from the Census Academy's webinar tab once the recording and transcripts are available. Please go to www.census.gov/academy. Please save all questions to the end of the presentation, and thank you for your continued support of our outreach and education efforts. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, welcome to the December LED webinar, Job-to-Job Flows and Consequences of Job Separation, with our presenter, Matthew Staiger. This presentation looks at literature documents of large and persistent average earnings losses following job displacement. The presentation, based on the paper, extends the literature on displaced workers by providing a comprehensive picture of earnings and employment outcomes for all workers who separate, and results that suggest that future research on the consequences of job loss should work to disentangle the strong association between non-employment and earning losses, as opposed to focusing specifically on displaced workers. Matthew Staiger is a Pathways intern at the U.S. Census Bureau and will be completing his PhD in economics from the University of Maryland this spring. He currently serves as dissertation scholar at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. With that, I hand it over to Matthew.
Thanks so much, Earlene, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. So as Earlene mentioned, I'll be talking about our paper, Job-to-Job Flows and the Consequences of Job Separations. And this is joint work with Bruce Fallick, John Haltwinger, and Erica McIntyre. And just a disclaimer up front, this is a project that uses confidential data from the U.S. Census Bureau. And so the standard disclaimer applies, which is that these results don't represent the views of the census, and everything, all the results have been reviewed to ensure that no confidential information is disclosed. So the motivation for this paper begins with the fact that the U.S. labor market exhibits a very high rate of worker reallocation. So workers are constantly changing jobs, moving from one firm to another. And existing research suggests that this high rate of reallocation has important benefits. So from an aggregate perspective, an important component of productivity growth comes from workers moving from low to high productivity firms. From an individual's perspective, an important way in which workers advance their careers and grow their earnings comes from changing jobs and moving to new firms, specifically to more productive firms. However, despite these beneficial aspects of worker reallocation, there's a general concern that some workers are harmed in the process. So there's a famous paper from the early 90s by Jacobson, Lalonde, and Sullivan that finds that there are large and persistent earnings losses for displaced workers. So displaced workers are often defined as workers who separate from a distressed firm, so a firm that is experiencing a large decline in employment by firing many workers. And so many subsequent papers have confirmed these large and persistent earnings losses. And a more recent strand of this literature has been working on trying to understand the source of these earnings losses. And so this literature on displaced workers has really highlighted some of the the costs of worker reallocation and the harms to workers. And so in this paper, we're going to extend the literature on displaced workers in two important ways. So first, we're going to estimate the earnings consequences of job separations for all separators, so looking at workers who separate from both distressed and from non-distressed firms. And second, we're going to examine how the earnings consequences of job separations depend on the amount of time it takes to find a new job. So just to give you a brief preview of results, we're going to tackle this question using administrative data from the United States, specifically from the LEHD program. And we have a couple of main findings. So first, we find that firm distress is not predictive of earnings losses. So workers who separate from non-distressed firms experience similarly large and persistent earnings losses compared to workers who separate from distressed firms. Rather, the key predictor of earnings losses is the amount of time it takes to find a new job. So workers who immediately find a new job after separating from their previous employer tend to experience modest earnings gains. And this is consistent with kind of the positive aspects or beneficial aspects of worker reallocation. In contrast, workers who spend an extended period of time in non-employment prior to finding a new job tend to experience large and persistent losses in earnings. So this speaks to the costs of worker reallocation. And furthermore, we find that spending time in non-employment before finding a new job is strongly associated with workers moving to lower paying and less productive firms. And so kind of the key implication of our findings is that we think that future work should really try to aim to better understand the strong relationship we find between earning losses and the amount of time workers spend in non-employment. And while we, in this paper, we can't with complete confidence pinpoint the mechanism that explains this relationship, we think that based on some of our results, we think that models of the labor market that emphasize the existence of job ladders, whereby some firms pay more than other firms, appear to be a really useful framework to study the problem. And so there are a couple recent papers by people like Gregor Jorash and Paweł Krolikowski who have developed models with job ladders to study the earnings of displaced workers. And while we think that these types of models are a useful starting point, none of the existing models or explanations in the literature offer a clear reason for why we see this very strong relationship between earnings losses and the duration of non-employment. So the empirical patterns we find in this paper are something to be explored in future work. So before jumping into the results, I will give you a brief overview of the data that we use to tackle this project. So as I mentioned, we use data from the United States, specifically from the LEHD program. And so this is an administrative data set that provides a quarterly panel of linked employer and employee data. And we're going to focus on a sample of workers from 5 large states, specifically California, North Carolina, Oregon, Wisconsin, and Washington. And there are, in terms of workers, there are a couple of important restrictions and definitions to mention at the outset. So we're going to focus on a group of workers who are employed with at least 3 years of tenure in 2005, of quarter 2 of 2005. And we're going to focus mainly on 2 types of workers. So the first type we're going to refer to as stayers. These are individuals who remained at that same employer through the end of 2005. So they stayed with their employer. And there's about 700,000 of these workers in our sample. And the second type of worker we're going to focus on are separators or permanent separators. And these are individuals who separated from their employer in 2005 and found a new employer within 8 quarters. And so there's about 200,000 of these workers in our sample. There are some workers who separate from their employer and then end up returning at a later date. We're going to refer to these as recalls. And for most of the analysis, we won't be focusing on these workers, since the focus of our paper is really about worker reallocation, so workers moving to new firms. From the employer perspective, the key definition to mention is the definition of distressed. So following the large literature on displaced workers, we define a distressed firm as a firm that experiences a decline in employment by at least 30% between 2005 quarter 2 and 2006 quarter 2. And then non-distressed firms are just the complement of that, so firms that aren't shrinking by a large amount. And because it's difficult to measure changes in employer size for very small firms, we're going to exclude firms with fewer than 50 employees from the sample. Okay, so this slide presents some basic summary stats, and kind of the main results from the paper are readily apparent from these simple summary statistics. So to describe what I have here, let's focus first on the right panel labeled distressed. And so what I'm doing here is I'm plotting the average quarterly earnings for different groups of workers. All of the workers in this right panel are were employed at a distressed firm in 2005. And I am plotting the quarterly earnings in the 3 years before and 6 years after this reference quarter. And so the solid black line plots the series for stayers, so workers who remain at that employer. The green line above that is the average quarterly earnings for workers who separate and find a new job in the same quarter in which they separate. And so as you can see, both the level and the trend of earnings for this group of separators is similar to the stayers. And then for this blue line here are the group of workers who separate and find a job in the adjacent quarter. And the remaining lines represent the average earnings of workers who separate and experience 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more quarters of non-employment before finding a new job. And what is immediately apparent from looking at this figure is that there's a strong relationship between the amount of time workers are spending in non-employment and the earnings losses. So it's really only for the workers who experience, an extended period of time in non-employment who we're seeing these large persistent declines in earnings relative to their pre-separation earnings. And the second thing to note from this figure is if we look over at the left panel, these are the analogous results produced for workers who are at non-distressed firms. And we see virtually the same patterns here, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So together, this set of simple summary statistics makes kind of 2 key points in the paper. One is that firm distress is not predictive of the earnings losses of separators. And 2, there's a strong association between earnings losses and the amount of time spent in non-employment. And so in the remainder of the paper, we're going to kind of formalize this relationship and then investigate some possible explanations for why we see such a strong relationship between time spent in non-employment and earning losses. So to do this, we're going to start by using a regression framework and estimate a distributed lag model, which is actually the exact specification used in the Jacobson, Lalonde, and Sullivan paper that I mentioned in the introduction slide. And so specifically, we are going to be focusing on a panel of quarterly labor market outcomes that includes data 6 years before and 6 years after the 2005 quarter 2 reference quarter. And our outcome variable is going to be quarterly earnings. And our main independent variables are an individual fixed effect, a quarter fixed effect, a polynomial and age interacted with sex, and then the key independent variable is an indicator for whether an individual is a separator interacted with the time since separation. And so this slide presents the key estimates from the empirical specification. On the right panel labeled distressed, we're presenting the estimates for workers who separate from distressed firms. And so these estimates here replicate the main findings of the original paper on displaced workers and show that workers who separate from a distressed firm experience a large immediate drop in earnings and then a gradual and only partial recovery. And so even 6 years after the separation, these earnings these workers are still suffering from about a $2,000 per quarter earnings penalty. So each year they're earning about $8,000 less than they would have had they not separated. And so looking then to the left panel, this presents results for non-distressed workers who are at non-distressed firms. And the key takeaway is that making a comparison between these two figures, it's clear that the earnings losses for workers who separate from non-distressed firms are both qualitatively and quantitatively similar to the earnings losses for workers who separate from distressed firms. So this again shows that firm distress does not seem to be very predictive or strongly associated with the earnings losses associated with job separation. And so the key innovation of this paper then is that we extend the distributed lag model in order to allow for heterogeneous effects by the amount of time it takes to find a new job, or how long workers spend in non-employment before becoming reemployed. And the estimates from that specification are presented in these two figures here. And so on the right panel, we see that the results are presented for distressed firms. And again, we see, as in the simple summary statistics, there's a strong relationship between duration of non-employment and the earnings losses. So workers who immediately find a job after making a job separation don't appear to suffer any meaningful earnings losses, whereas workers who are spending more than a couple quarters in non-employment before finding a new job are suffering really substantial long-term persistent earnings losses. And again, the comparison between the distressed and non-distressed sample reveals that we find very similar patterns in terms of the relationship between earnings losses and time spent in non-employment for both of these samples. So we also look at the relationship between the time spent in non-employment and the growth rate of the firm that individuals are separating from. In this figure, what I've done is plotted the proportion of individuals who are employed by a given quarter after separation. And these proportions are presented separately for 4 different groups of firms. So rapidly shrinking, so these are the distressed firms that are shrinking rapidly, slowly shrinking, slowly growing, and rapidly growing. And the main takeaway from this figure is that the growth rate of the firm from which a worker separates does not appear to be related at all to how long it takes workers to find a new job. And so in light of the results that I showed you in the previous 2 slides, this finding should not be too surprising. One thing I will note here is that we do find some interesting results when looking at recalls. So this figure, much of the previous analysis all the previous analysis has been focusing on workers who separate and then find a new job at a different firm. Recalls are workers who separate but then return to the same firm. And this figure shows that workers who separate from rapidly shrinking firms, so this green series here, are much less likely to ever be recalled than workers separating from more healthy firms that are growing more rapidly. And so I guess the point here is just to say that, highlighting that we are, in fact, in this paper, focusing on permanent separators, so workers who change employers, and that recalls are kind of a separate phenomenon which, should be dealt with separately. So I guess the key question then at this point is what is the explanation for this strong relationship between earnings losses and the time spent in non-employment? So in this paper, we're unable to provide a perfectly convincing answer of what this mechanism is. However, we do have several results that shed light on the plausibility of a couple of different competing explanations. So I'll talk about a few of those now. So one possible explanation is that these patterns are driven by worker heterogeneity. So more specifically, differences across workers may be correlated with earnings losses and the duration of non-employment. So for example, workers may differ in their attachment to the labor market, and workers who are more weakly attached to the labor market may be more likely to spend a significant period in non-employment and may be more likely to accept lower wages upon finding a new job. However, we have a number of results that suggest that worker heterogeneity is not driving the results. The key intuition here is that these explanations that have to do with worker heterogeneity are really much more relevant for workers who are separating for reasons based on their own choices. And in using several different methods, we show that our main results are robust within different samples that vary to the extent to which we think that workers are separating for reasons that are driven by their own choices. So, for example, I previously showed you that the earnings consequences are similar for workers from distressed and non-distressed firms. Workers who separate from distressed firms are much more likely to separate because of decisions made by the firm and not the worker. Indeed, that's part of the reason why the literature is focused so much on distressed, workers who separate from distressed firms, whereas workers who separate from non-distressed firms are much more likely to do so because of their own decisions. And the fact that we observe similar patterns within these two samples provides some evidence that worker heterogeneity is not driving the results. A second possible explanation is that has to do with labor demand. So it could be that some workers are experiencing a decline in demand for the skill set they have, and this makes it more difficult to find a job and also more difficult to find or more likely that they're going to suffer an earnings loss when they do eventually find a job. However, suggesting against this mechanism is that we find that our main results are robust within subsamples defined by the strength of the local labor market. So in particular, we measure local labor market strength by the employment growth rate within industries or occupations within a state. And while this might be a coarse measure of local labor market conditions, the results at least don't provide any indication that the relationship between earnings losses and non-employment is driven by changes in labor demand. The third possible explanation has to do with human capital. So it could be that the human capital of a worker depreciates while non-employed. Well, we don't have any direct evidence on this mechanism. We think that it's not the likely candidate here because it seems a little strange that we would find such large and persistent earnings losses for relatively short spells of non-employment. So if the results were to be driven by human capital would have to depreciate at a very rapid rate that seems somewhat implausible to us. And the last likely contender is a story about job ladder. So it's possible that it's difficult to find a job at a high-paying firm if you're searching from a state of non-employment. And on this last mechanism, we actually find some evidence that is quite consistent with this explanation. So this evidence that I'm presenting on here shows that workers who spend more time in non-employment before finding a new job tend to move to lower-paying firms. In particular, what we do here is we leverage the entire LEHD, so all workers in the LEHD, and estimate firm-specific pay premium using the AKM empirical model. So specifically, we regress log earnings on worker and firm fixed effects, and under a certain set of assumptions, the firm fixed effects can be interpreted as firm-specific pay premium. And then what we do is we calculate the difference for workers who separate. We calculate the difference between the firm pay premium at their origin firm and the firm that they end up at. And then using a regression, we look at the relationship between the change in the firm fixed effect and the growth rate at the firm, as well as the amount of time workers spend in non-employment, which is plotted on the x-axis. And so what these results suggest is that in this in the point farthest to the left, for workers who make a within-quarter transition, so find a new job in the same quarter in which they separate from their original employer, these workers tend to move to firms that pay about 2% more. However, moving to the right on the figure, we see that workers who spend at least 4 quarters in non-employment before finding a new job tend to move to firms that pay about 10% less. And furthermore, we see fairly similar patterns for workers that separate from rapidly shrinking to rapidly growing firms. And so to get a better sense of how closely or how much of the results, our results could be explained by these differences in firm-specific pay premium, we can compare these estimates to what we find at the individual level. So on the right figure here, I'm simply reproducing the same figure from the previous graph. And now on the left-hand side, we're estimating a similar specification, but now the outcome variable is the log difference in individual earnings instead of the firm-specific pay premium. So this figure on the left simply confirms the main findings of the paper, which is that firm distress is not particularly predictive of earnings losses, but time spent in non-employment is strongly predictive of earnings losses. So we see that these individuals who are spending 1 to 4 or more quarters in non-employment are experiencing large earnings losses. And the important thing then to take away from this slide is we can then compare these results with the individual earnings to those that are looking at the firm fixed effect. And our main takeaway from this is that, clearly the individual effects appear to be a bit larger than the than the difference in the firm fixed effects, at least in the differences across duration of time spent in non-employment. But they're not the differences between these two figures are not an order of magnitude. So we think that the comparison between these two figures suggests that one important reason, maybe not the whole reason, but one important reason why workers tend to suffer larger earnings losses when spending time more time in non-employment is because they tend to move to lower paying firms. So I'll just wrap up here then. And just to summarize the main findings of the paper, we find that earnings losses are not specific to separations from distressed firms. So workers who separate from non-distressed firms experience similarly large and persistent earnings losses after a job separation. Rather, the key predictor of earnings losses appears to be the amount of time spent in non-employment. So workers who make an immediate job-to-job transition tend to experience modest earnings gains, whereas those who spend a substantial period of time in non-employment tend to suffer large earnings losses. And furthermore, duration of time spent in non-employment also appears to be associated with movements to lower paying firms. And so I guess the key implication of the paper, to reiterate, is that existing models of the labor market cannot readily explain this strong association between earnings losses and non-employment. And we think that building on models that emphasize the role of imperfect competition in producing job ladders, in extending those models so that they can incorporate this empirical relationship between earnings losses and time spent in non-employment, this should be a priority for future work. And so one last thing that I'll end on here is that I want to emphasize that the point of our paper is not to say that the emphasis on displaced workers is misplaced. And there's a couple of reasons why we might, even given these findings, we might be particularly interested in displaced workers. The first is that even if displaced workers, so workers who separate from a distressed firm, experience similar earnings losses to workers who separate from a non-distressed firm, we might still think that workers who separate from a distressed firm might have greater welfare losses, especially if we think that those separations are either more likely to be unanticipated or more likely to be involuntary. And then the second point is that separations from distressed firms are more likely to be exogenous in that they're less likely to be driven by choices made by the worker. And this simplifies the interpretation of the empirical estimates of looking at the earnings consequences of workers who separate from a distressed firm. And so we think there are some good reasons why we should be particularly interested in workers who separate from distressed firms and displaced workers. But our point here is that if we really want to understand what's driving these earnings losses, we should turn our focus to the role that time spent in non-employment is playing. So that's all I have. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to now stick around and respond to any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Once again, if you would like to submit a question or a comment, please press star 1 on your phone, record your name, and your line will be open. That is star, then 1. To withdraw your question, you may press star 2. One moment as questions queue up, please.
Thank you, Matt. I would like to ask that we please keep your questions pertaining to the presentation with only one follow-up question. And if you have any questions pertaining to the 2020 census, please go to 2020census.gov. While you were giving your presentation, we actually had a few questions that came in on the chat. One of the questions was, will you be providing a bibliography regarding the presentation?
So I don't have that in the slides, but we currently have a working paper, Cleveland Fed working paper out that has all of the citations that are in the paper and I believe also in these slides as well. So if you just Google the name of the paper, you should be able to find it online, and that will have all the citations there.
Okay, and then another question was, are there separators within the stayers or in 3/4 a typo? And that was on slide 5.
So sorry, could you, I can't, for some reason I can't see the chat. Can you repeat that last question?
Yes, it's, are there separators within the stayers or is 3Q a typo?
So I don't believe there's a typo here. The group, I guess to clarify a little bit, the group of stayers and separators are a distinct group of workers. So stayers are individuals who remain at the employer that they were at in Q2 of 2005 for 3 additional quarters, so through the end of 2005. And separators, in contrast, are workers who leave their employer in Q2 of 2005, and within 8 quarters, they find a new job at some other firm. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
And the other question is, do we know anything about industry or occupation of those separated or the other job characteristics when re-employed?
So in the paper, we do provide some descriptive statistics that characterize the workers in our sample. So I can say a couple things on that. So for example, like I know like the most common industry from which the distressed separators are coming from is durable manufacturing, whereas I think the more another common industry for non-distressed separators is retail trade, and so we do in the paper have some details about like where these individuals are coming from. We haven't done much in terms of looking at like industry switching, so whether or not like the difference between the industry that people start at and where they end up at. It's something that we potentially could do with the data, but that was kind of outside of the scope of the paper for now.
And Matt, there's a few more questions in the chat. So do you have plans to explore whether age has any effect upon the earnings? So
one of the things we do in the paper, which is part of this, when we're trying to rule out this possible explanation, so we try to rule out the possibility that the relationship between earnings losses and the time spent in non-employment is driven by worker heterogeneity, so just differences across workers. And one of the things we do there is cut the sample by different subgroups of workers, partly defined based on their age. And so within all of the samples that we've looked at so far, we continue to find this strong relationship between time spent in non-employment and earnings losses, and a very weak relationship between firm distress and earnings losses. We haven't explicitly dug into whether or not there's kind of heterogeneity in the earnings losses by age. So, for example, like if kind of young workers appear to experience substantially larger earnings losses. I know other work has done that, but that's not been that wasn't kind of the focus of our paper, and so we haven't looked into that at all.
All right. And were you able to plot and see any differences between males and females that had separated?
So we have, I guess this is a similar answer to the last question. We have, to the extent that we've looked at subgroups, it's been less to examine whether or not like there's differences across these groups and more to try to understand whether or not we're seeing the same patterns in terms of this relationship between non-employment and earnings losses within all of the subgroups. So we have looked at the results by, for example, in a sample of prime age men who are between the ages of 35 and 44, and I've compared what those results look like to results that are estimated on a sample of women who are aged 25 to 34, and even to women who are new mothers, so who give birth around 2005 Q2. And within all of these different samples, we continue to find this strong role of non-employment in its relation to earnings losses. At least excluding the results for new mothers, if I'm remembering correctly, we see fairly similar results like across the sample of men and women. But definitely the emphasis of the paper has not been so much to compare the effects for men and women, but rather to see if the main findings in terms of this relationship between earnings losses and non-employment is robust within those different subgroups, and that certainly is the case.
Another question is it possible the lower earnings could be associated with personal household distress and desperation?
So I think this is another. Yeah. So okay. So I guess there's a few ways to think about it. One way to interpret that question is that it is a explanation in which time spent in non-employment is actually producing these earnings losses. So you could imagine a scenario where someone loses their job, and as they spend more and more time in non-employment, they're draining their savings, and they become more and more desperate to find a job. So, the first month, maybe they would only accept kind of a pretty decent paying job, but by a year after they've lost their job, they would accept any job. And this could be explaining this relationship between the duration of non-employment and earnings losses, because it's only the ones who are finding a job a year later who are taking these, the fast food restaurant at McDonald's, the job at McDonald's. So this is definitely one of the explanations and possible mechanisms we have in mind. And I think this is like, so I think that the results that we have on this suggest that if this is part of the story, then it seems that part of this is happening because if workers are becoming increasingly desperate, they're becoming increasingly likely to accept a job at a low-paying firm. And so I think that's definitely a possible explanation, and trying to differentiate between that and other explanations is kind of an interesting area for future research.
Okay, we do have questions online.
Oh, I'm sorry, Katrina. You go.
Okay. First question is with Carmen Hardiman. Your line is now open.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, you know what? I just typed mine out, and I'm hoping you can get it. I went to the RTT. The other party can see my typing. Can I send that transcript through? Because it's a little bit detailed to address. I've been through Department of Vocational Rehabilitation Services from 2002 all the way up until they basically tried to say that there was nothing else they could do for me. I have my documentation. It took me 3.5 years to get it. We've been in Lawton, Oklahoma, from Fort Sill, Lawton, Oklahoma, since 1995. We were supposed to have been family retired in 2008, and it did not happen. I've been to so many different agencies, and filed things.
Katrina, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can. Thank you.
Okay.
And we apologize for that technical glitch. Not sure if it was maybe one of the callers, but it looks like we're back to normal. So I believe you can proceed with your questions, or you can go ahead and take back over, Arlene.
Thank you. So I do have another question in the chat, and it's very extensive. So could the slightly higher earnings for workers in distressed firms that were unemployed for not more than 1 quarter be due to the reasons for separation? That is, more high-quality applicants would be laid off for financial reasons, and they get snapped up quickly. Also, could you elaborate on worker heterogeneity? Okay, I'm sorry. Is there someone on the call that is asking the question?
Nope.
Okay. So, Matt, were you able to hear that question?
Yeah. Actually, I'm trying to. Is there a way for me to see the chat?
Yeah. So if you click on the bubble that says chat, you should be able to see it. It should be down in the right-hand corner.
Okay. Now I got it.
All right. You see that question?
For the slightly higher earnings for workers. Okay, yeah, I need a second to reread it. So I'm not sure if I understand the first part of the question. Happy if someone can clarify. Happy to try to give a better answer to it. But in terms of the second part of the question and just elaborating on worker heterogeneity, I guess what we mean by that is when we're trying to understand. So empirically, we see that there's an association between workers the amount of time spent in non-employment and earnings losses, and the kind of worker heterogeneity bullet point was simply referring to the idea that it's possible that some of this relationship could be driven by kind of unobserved differences in workers. So it might be that workers who tend to take extended breaks from the labor market are the same types of workers who tend to accept lower wages upon returning. And so in that story, there might be nothing kind of, we might not be particularly concerned about the earnings losses of people who spend time in unemployment because it's really resulting from a choice that these workers are making. However, a number of pieces of results in the paper, some of which I talked about in the presentation, suggest that this type of explanation that emphasizes the role of worker heterogeneity is not the thing that's driving the results.
Did you want me to continue reading from the chat, or are you?
We do have several questions in the queue.
Okay, go ahead, Katrina. Sorry.
Okay. Chris McLaren, your line is now open.
Oh, thank you. Matt, this is a very interesting presentation. And actually, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Oh, okay, great. So my question is really about you mentioned that there are stayers and separators. Did you also find or and maybe you answered this earlier and I didn't catch it, but were there people in your sample that separated but did not find a job within the time period you looked at? And if so, were there any differences in based on whether someone lost a job from a distressed or a non-distressed firm?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We do find, so about 10% of workers who separate in our sample never end up, or at least do not find a new job within 8 quarters, within 2 years. That number is actually pretty similar between the distressed and non-distressed samples. And basically one of the reasons why we exclude those people from the sample is it's not really clear what's going on with those workers. So it's possible that it really is the case that 10% of workers of these people who separate are just, remain unemployed or leave the workforce. But it's also possible that they take up jobs that are not covered in the data that we're using. So the coverage of the LEHD is fairly complete. But there are definitely gaps in the data. So certain government jobs, jobs in agriculture, or some states have periods where they're not fully reporting. And so for that reason, that we don't include them in the analysis. But at least for differences between the distressed and non-distressed firms, we find a similar proportion of individuals fall into this category of never finding a new job within the 2-year period.
Okay, and thank you. And just a really quick follow-up. When you're looking at the data by state, so if someone were to move out of the state, you wouldn't be picking up their earnings, correct?
So we actually would.
You would, okay.
The restrictions that I mentioned on state are applied to the sample that we consider, defined by like where they are in 2005. But for anyone who moves to another state, we're going to continue to measure their earnings there. The one exception to that is that there's a handful of states that don't begin reporting to the LEHD data set until later on in the 2000s. And if someone moved to one of those states, we just wouldn't have earnings on them. But for the vast majority of people, we would be able to track them as they moved to other states.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question comes from Steve Sims. Your line is now open.
Steve Sims, who's that?
Okay, you said Steve Sims?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you have a question, Steve? Okay. All right, the next question is from Carmen. Arden, your line is now open.
Okay, thank you. I was on and I started asking questions and I did type mine through and then I didn't hear anything and I was not sure if you all were able to get my question. It was about the fact that we have been military since like way back in the late 70s, 80s, all the way till now we're supposed to be family retired. The soldier retired himself and then did not retire the rest of the family. Me on the LES is reported as spouse, and I'm still married to him, but we're separated. We have 3 children, 3 grandchildren, and I've been through the Lawton, Oklahoma, the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation Services. There was no help. I was actually screamed at in quite a few of their sessions. I went to them on a regular basis, but I didn't even meet the actual case worker, and I signed into the oh, go ahead. Yes.
This is not pertaining to the presentation.
It's not about labor and working and displaced workers?
It doesn't sound like it's pertaining to that, but if you would like to send a question to me, I will try to put
How do I do that?
Somebody.
Okay, what do I do for getting that sent to you? How do I do that?
I'm going to put my email in the chat.
Oh, now how do I access the chat? Is that what where I typed my question in already?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, at this time, there are no further questions in queue.
Matt, did you see all the questions in the chat?
I have the chat open, so I can try to scan through these and see if there's any ones I didn't answer here.
And then if you could, does your last slide have your contact information?
You know what? I didn't put my contact information is not on here. I will write my email in the chat right now, though.
Okay. So if you would just go through the chat and just try to answer the questions, and if anyone needs to be in touch with you, they can also contact me. So. Do you want to answer those questions?
Yeah, so I'm going through now. So I got one question that says, how are job ladders defined in the study or data? So in the results I showed you on the slide, on these slides, we use a measure of job ladders that leverage earnings and account for different characteristics across workers. So in particular, that measure of job ladders is based on an empirical methodology pioneered by a well-known paper by Eval Karmars and Margolis, and that comes from basically that measure of job ladder comes from regressing log earnings on worker and firm fixed effects, and the measure of the job ladder is basically the firm fixed effect from that regression. In the paper, we also look at a number of other ways of defining job ladders. So there's a wide class of models that predict that kind of imperfect competition in the labor market produces these job ladders. And those class of models suggest that kind of firms that are higher up on the job ladder they should pay more and they should also be more productive. And so in the paper, we look at different measures of job ladders that use average earnings and also data on productivity, and we find similar results with these other measures of how to define job ladders. Let's see. So I got one question that says, do you believe the results of your study would be similar if you updated the data to be more current? So this is a great question. In the paper, we actually look at we do replicate our main results in different samples that span different points in the business cycle. So specifically, instead of just looking at workers who were employed in 2005 quarter 2, we also look at workers who were employed in 1999, 2001, and 2009. So very different points of the business cycle. And within all of those different points, we continue to find the core results, which is that there's very little relationship between the between firm distress and earnings losses, and there's a very strong relationship between duration of time spent in non-employment and earnings losses. So I think probably if we looked at even more recent data, we would continue to find similar things, although not sure what things would look like if you looked at them in the current economic crisis. But one I guess interesting thing to point is that we do find some differences relative to some older studies in terms of some older work found very small earnings losses for workers who separate from non-distressed firms. And we think that the difference between those older studies and our study is partly due to place and time. And so while I'm reasonably confident that the results would be robust, at least up to this current recession, I do think place and time plays an important role here. Okay, so I got another very good question that says, speaking of McDonald's, what about when automation eliminates low-paying jobs? And I think this is kind of like very consistent with the overall motivation of the paper, which is that we observe these large costs in terms of large earnings losses for people who are losing their jobs. And this could happen either because this could happen from automation, this could happen from trade, or just from kind of some normal competitive processes in the labor market. And so automation may be part of the reason why we see job loss. And I think the key point here is just that if we want to devise effective policies that mitigate these adverse consequences of job loss, we really need to understand why it is that job loss is associated with such large and persistent losses in earnings. And so our paper is trying to push a little bit on that front to give us a little better idea of why it is that we observe these earnings losses.
Okay, I think that's all I see in the chat. I would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. The LED webinar series will continue again February 17, 2021 at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, happy holidays and please stay safe.
Thank you all for your participation. You may disconnect. Speakers, remain on the line, please.